Operation Transparency, shedding light on the corruption of the system or the other side of power. Corruption is the gangrene of modern societies. This evil spares neither states nor big companies, nor international institutions. Where power and money are concentrated, that's where it is. Questionable arrangements, conflicts of interest, and personal enrichments thrive. And in many cases, power and corruption have become one. The slogan of some elites could be dirty hands, full pockets, but always straight in their boots. And above all, never responsible, and even less guilty. While honest citizens respect the laws and pay the bill, the untouchables stuff themselves. Let corruption reign. Society as a whole is shaken. Corruption accompanies as much as it produces the collapse of society. In this new program of Fréquence Populaire, our objective is to unmask this corrupt, to show what is behind the scenes of power, to denounce, to reveal, to inform, to reveal what others want to hide. Our mission to put corruption in the spotlight and to reveal what those who believe they are the untouchables of the system do. For citizens to regain power, for things to finally change, welcome to Operation Transparency. First episode of Operation Transparency, NATO in the turmoil of corruption, and it furiously resembles Madame von der Leyen's little issue. The next NATO summit will take place from 24 to 26 June 2025 at the World Forum in The Hague in the Netherlands. And in parallel with this NATO summit, there is a crisis at NSPA. But what is NSPA? A lot of people don't know. NSPA is the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. In plain English, it is NATO Support and Acquisition Agency. The NSPA is in crisis just before the NATO summit due to internal scandals linked to possible corruption issues. The head of the Support and Acquisition Agency, Stacey Cummings, is in the eye of the storm as she is the target of an internal NATO investigation. Why is this NSPA of NATO important? Important for you, citizens. What does this have to do with you? You who, at first glance, for many of you, did not even know about this NATO Support and Acquisition Agency. Let's remember that NATO is the military superstructure under direct orders from Washington. It is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance that structures the European Union, and which has, over the years, subjugated the states of the European Union, which have gradually lost their geostrategic sovereignty. NATO is surely the primary cause of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, as Jens Stoltenberg, the previous Secretary General of NATO, clearly declared, is a war of NATO extension. The Russians are now refusing this expansion of NATO, going to the extreme of the war that we have known since February 24, 2022. In the context of the current negotiations in Istanbul, well, the Russians are asking as a first condition that Ukraine should never join NATO. And so, yes, without the extension of NATO, there would certainly have been no war in Ukraine and certainly no seizure of Crimea by Russia. Unfortunately, the story is as it is, and we will not go back over it. But now that this war is in place, the United States, especially Donald Trump, are demanding more military spending from European states. They no longer want to ensure the defense of the European continent. Europeans now must reach into their pockets and stop taking advantage of the United States. Well, at least that's how Donald Trump sees it. And that's how more and more Americans are seeing it. At first, he asked for 2% of GDP in military spending, but now he is asking for straight up 5% of GDP. Several states, including Poland and Germany, have committed themselves to meeting this requirement. Moreover, Poland is very, very close to it. But it is absolutely crazy in a context of economic crisis in which Europe is sinking. These insane new defense spendings obviously need to be financed. But how? France, for example, is already considerably indebted, more than 3.3 trillion euros, or more than 115% of its GDP. The money will have to be taken somewhere. Besides, many people have been telling us for the last 3 years that we will have to choose between defending European values by force of arms, whatever they may be. They are less and less clear, especially as far as democracy is concerned. We have seen it in several European countries, such as recently in Romania, and perhaps soon in Poland, either its social security or its war against the Russians. We can see the choice that is currently being made. There is also this European loan recommended by the Draghi report. The one, remember, that we did not release before the European elections, when it was all fresh, hot, ready to be released. And yes, it was not released to limit the rout of Macron's party and its allies in Europe. And what does the Draghi report recommend? What, 800 billion in debt? 800 billion European loans, and of these loans must be directed to military spending, the purchase of military equipment. But the European defense industry, although flourishing, especially in France and Germany, cannot absorb orders for such an enormous volume and for so many European countries, especially if we need to equip ourselves very quickly, which is what all the warmongers in Europe are recommending. We simply don't have the production lines at the moment to make such investments. As a result, we will inevitably have to buy abroad from foreign countries. There will, of course, be purchases from India, from South Korea, here and there, but above all, they will be made from the leading power of NATO, meaning from the United States, thanks to its immense military-industrial complex, which, let's remember, has been considered since 1956. It dates back to 1956. It was during the presidency of the great American president, Dwight Eisenhower, the one who had been the commanding-in-chief of the Allied forces on the Western side against the Nazis, who had coordinated and organized the Normandy landings. Once he became president, at the end of his presidency, he had this famous speech where he said that American democracy was in danger of falling into the hands of the military-industrial complex. He feared this in 1956, considering that this military-industrial complex is today infinitely more powerful than it was at the time of President Eisenhower. However, this military-industrial complex is corrupt and corrupting.
However, this is where the NATO Support and Procurement Agency intervenes. Yes, NSPA is a barbaric name. The NSPA currently has a budget of 7 billion euros per year. It is based in Luxembourg and plays a central role in military logistics, as well as in the joint purchasing and operational support for member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Here are the main missions of the NSPA. The first is integrated logistical support for all NATO countries, i.e. 32 countries, the transport, storage, and distribution of military equipment, the maintenance of complex equipment, vehicles, aircraft, weapon systems, fuel supply, ammunition, spare parts. It's getting interesting, especially with the war going on in Ukraine. Medical support, infrastructure, food, accommodation. It ensures group purchases for NATO countries, pooling the needs of member states to obtain better prices. When you hear the best prices for armaments, there is always something fishy going on. The management of arms or strategic equipment contracts, and the purchase of weapon systems for multinational refueling aircrafts, MRTT drones, etc. So when you consider this, since around the beginning of the 20th century, NATO has set up an extremely intelligent system. In fact, it is called Smart Defense, whose objective was to pool military skills and military industries of European states in order to bring them into line with each other, obviously under the NATO standard, that is to say, under the American standard. You understand how important this agency is becoming in the current geopolitical context. And war, the sale of arms, is the heart. It is the absolute heart of corruption. Whenever there is war, there is corruption. You can see it very clearly in Russia at the moment. Regularly, generals, senior officers, government officials, senior officials are arrested for one or another act of corruption linked to the arms contract. It happens a little bit in Ukraine too, but here the corruption is even more massive. The country was already the most corrupt or one of the most corrupt before the war. So you can only imagine during the war, because war, once again, is the place of all the national and international corruptions. All these huge purchases of European weapons, in fact, for a war that will not take place with Russia, but for the assured destruction of our public service, will largely pass through this agency. The NSPA agency also provides support for military operations. It allows the rapid supply of logistical resources to deployed forces, as well as support for NATO missions. And then the NSPA also does management of projects for the member states of the organization. So it's meant for technical assistance for the modernization of forces. That's nice, technical assistance for the modernization of forces. In fact, this is empty talk, meant to worsen interdependence and therefore the dominance of weapon systems under the same umbrella, and therefore the dominance of the United States over European armed forces. Yes, we are actually very, very far from the great, powerful European army that little Emmanuel Macron dreamed of while boxing. It is also the rehabilitation of military sites. It is the construction of warehouses or infrastructures. It is the advice on logistics optimization and supply chains for various armies. In short, it is the heart of war. Indeed, logistics are the heart of war. They have always been. So this agency is the absolute heart of NATO. Well, officially, NSPA does not depend on a single country. It acts on behalf of all NATO members, who, of course, are all absolutely equal on paper. It's a great story, and it's obviously nonsense. The decision maker is Washington. And you are going to understand how wrong this official position is. The NSPA, therefore, manages billions of euros in arms contracts and defense every year, making it sensitive to the risk of corruption. As in the recent revelations of the letter. The magazine, The Letter, highlights this.
The letter thus reveals that there is an internal investigation that targets the general manager of this agency, a certain Stacey Cummings. But as another issue, there is her management. She seems to be quite prescriptive.
Well, these issues couldn't have come at a worse time, right before the NATO summit, at the end of June, where the member states, especially European countries, will try to satisfy Donald Trump I'd even say extremist, budgetary demands and stand together.
With its new military spending to deal with the Russian threat. Or in any case, we're at the supposed Russian threat. Since the Russian army at the same time is unable to invade Ukraine and at the same time threatens to invade all of Europe. It's called Russophrenia. Schizophrenia is Russophrenia. At the same time, they are going to conquer everything, and at the same time, they are unable to move forward. You have to make the choice. And so rumors of corruption come at a very bad time because the NSPA is the main player, as you have understood, in NATO for purchases of military and civilian equipment that are about to explode. And given the new announced expenses, the NSPA budget will also explode. And its control over arms purchases, which is still very opaque, will be absolutely complete. So things are so bad at NSPA that NSPA has organized a crisis town hall. Oh my God, town halls smells like corporate management lingo. Well, that's exactly it. The term town hall is used to refer to a public meeting or a citizens' assembly organized to allow political leaders, elected officials, or company managers to meet directly as their citizens or employees, and then to explain to them the business strategy or the problems we are facing. And now it was necessary to organize a town hall in front of all the 1,550 employees of the agency. So it was held on Friday, May 16th at its headquarters in Luxembourg. Yes, it is based in Luxembourg, and it was broadcast on video to the various antennas. So you did not know it. There is one in Versailles, in Yvelines, one in Hungary, and one in Italy. Well, the town halls are as democratic as the meetings between Emmanuel Macron and the people during the Yellow Vest movement. You remember, people are selected, everything is more or less organized, and then the boss speaks. Well, the boss, Stacey Cummings, spoke, and she spoke for an hour to employees who were quite attentive to what she had to say. She was supervised by two people. One, Nicholas Newhouse-Amy, the executive officer, who is literally her guard dog, and Dan Rooks. Both are in charge of internal investigations at home. Things are well maintained, and in other words, with such a well-kept house, well, it's nothing but scapegoats that will pay for a few meager revelations of corruption, while the big part remains in the shadows. Stacey Cummings, the head of the agency, announced that she would report on the corruption case involving several of her employees. She did so on Monday, May 19th to all 32 NATO nations during a meeting obviously behind closed doors. And she confirmed that, well, yes, it's terrible. There are corruption problems and they amount to around a few €100 million. So put that way, it obviously seems terrible. Well, it is obvious it is a joke. It's the top of the iceberg. It's a few €100 million and it concerns a few lamposters. Arms contracts amount in reality to billions of dollars.
And this anti-corruption activity makes it possible to give the illusion of a clean hand operation of which it controls all aspects. And so the scapegoats that were arrested, that's the function of the scapegoats. The federal prosecutor's office in Brussels, who is conducting a fairly discreet investigation in corruption and money laundering, arrested 2 Belgians. One of them stayed in prison for a long time. A former head of international purchasing from the Ministry of Defense of the Netherlands was also arrested in Amsterdam. And then there was another one in Spain. It is said that secondary agents in charge of buying marine fuel and ammunition have been arrested. There's also going to be an investigation conducted in the United States, but it will be conducted by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which we know so well from so many movies we've seen. They're calling the shots there, and there will obviously be no information that will filter out here, of course. So the executive director, Stacey Cummings, talked about corruption at the meeting, at this town hall, and at the closed-door meeting. She talked about transparency, what a beautiful word that is, transparency, but we should talk about smoke and mirrors instead. Indeed, the agency's human resources director, a certain Geneviève Machin, her real name is actually Geneviève Machin, tried at the town hall bravely, in front of everyone, to call on the boss, Ms. Cummings, this HR director, human resources director, accuse the boss, Stacey Cummings, for ignoring internal reports of fraud and corruption, and also for using its private internal investigation unit to file criminal cases against senior NSPA officials whom she wanted to see leave the agency. And besides, before this town hall, Geneviève Machin outright wrote a report letter to the Secretary General of NATO, the current and very warmongering Mark Rutte. But the end result was that the Human Resources Director, Ms. Geneviève Machin, who had alerted to the facts of corruption, not those that Ms. Cummings and others spoke about transparently, her contract was suspended and was not renewed. It is the approach of Stacey Cummings that now serves as human resources. It must be said that Mrs. Stacey Cummings steers her ship with an iron fist. While her agency only has a quarter of NATO's 6,500 employees, it concentrates half of internal complaints in what is the equivalent of NATO labor courts and half of long-term sick leave. There is even a union. Imagine there is a union in NATO. It's called the Confederation of NATO Civilian Employee Committees. Suffice to say to you that it is obviously not a revolutionary union, but still, sound the alarm. They are worried about the working environment at the NSPA, which is said to be a heavy atmosphere, where sounding the alarm and worrying will be the maximum these people ever do. And then we learned in particular that a Frenchman was suspended by the boss, Ms. Cummings, who internally uses these methods and these watchdogs. And he is a certain Patrick Fesque. Not Pesque, but Fesque, who had been an important purchasing manager at this agency for over 20 years. And now it's a small sidebar, but extremely interesting one. This Frenchman, Patrick Fesque, still is, for now, he remains the only French person to have reached the A6 grade, which is the highest rank of directors of the agency. The only one. There were no others. And obviously in France, it was already too much. So, for Ms. Cummings, almost all of the main management positions in the agency are intended for Anglo-Saxons and primarily for Americans. So that's just for the naive people who think we have a say in NATO since we returned to integrated command. All of this is nice empty talk and a lot of smoke and mirrors aimed at the mass media. Obviously, the United States is not going to favor the main other arms manufacturer within NATO. Oh no! The objective is still to sell arms from the American military industrial complex. No Rafales or Caesar cannons. You're not thinking about it, are you? We're not going to keep a French A6. Therefore, Patrick Fesque was suspended in November 2022. Well, that's old, huh? Under some pretense, he was suspended. But hey, since it was nonsense, the poor man was restored to his rights. The agency even paid him compensation. He has resumed functions, but not his original functions. He is now the agency's global head of pencils and erasers. There you go. He is simply perfectly placed under the title of advisor, which doesn't mean anything. On the other hand, her position, the boss, is a bit odd. Stacey Cummings, again, she placed in that position, guess,
Ooh, brother, what country does the one that replaced our one break that port hand for? Come on, 1, 2, 3, you won. He's an American. He also requested it from the HR department. Remember, Geneviève Machin. You have to follow out of any usual recruitment protocol. And do you think that during that time, Macron, who acts cocky and shows off his boxing skills, would have protested for France or one of our prime ministers? Well, no, obviously. What a strange idea. You know, it's a little bit like, just like in Brussels, there are mostly non-French lobbyists in Brussels, a lot of Germans, a lot of Americans, but not a lot of French people. So even in the instance they defend, these people are not interested in defending France's interest within the framework of the supranational bodies that are the European Union and NATO. Then let's move on. Contacted about the internal management crisis, but also about the investigation into the corruption case, the NSPA replied that it did not comment publicly on the allegations. Go ahead, look elsewhere. However, the HRD mentioned other scandals, other potential corruption scandals in the agency than those that were investigated. As I told you, they were forced to open an internal investigation, but all of this is obviously a first-class funeral. The internal investigation will lead to nothing. We can also consider that Geneviève Machin is a whistleblower or that she acted at the request of her government. And yes, Geneviève Machin is indeed Canadian. And Ottawa may have wanted to give a little push to the wind to Donald Trump with his desire to annex Canada. Maybe. Maybe she's authentic. Whistleblower, we won't know. But the interesting thing is that you have to look at who Stacey Cummings is to understand why nothing will happen, and that she is a key figure in the process of U.S. domination over Europe and in the process of selling American arms to vassalize Europeans. Pay attention to the fact that Stacey Cummings is a former function manager from the Undersecretary of Defense for Procurement and Logistical Support. Guess what country? The United States of America. And yes, Stacey Cummings is American, and the position she holds in NATO, well, she held it for the American Army directly under the American Defense Minister. Secretary of Defense in the United States is the Minister of Defense in the United States. That is the Minister of Defense. She was Undersecretary in that position. So Miss Stacey Cummings is a career member of the Senior Executive Service, the body of top federal officials in the United States. And she mainly worked at the Ministry of Defense in a whole series of positions at a very, very high level, and especially for acquisition and logistical support. Again, the role of NSPA. In that position, she was responsible, guess what, to the minister. Once again, the acquisition of weapons, the management of arms, contracts, logistics, and availability of equipment, the installations of new military bases, operational energy, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. Yes, just that. In short, this represents the entire defense industrial base. You can imagine that it is a key player in the entire industry of the American defense environment. And so her title was to advise the defense on arms purchases. She is extremely familiar with the entire military industrial sector of the United States. And of course, her main function is to push in any way possible, including through the means of corruption, pressure, and friendly advice. The careers in NATO, in the EU, or elsewhere, to promote the multiple, the mini agents that abound in all these agencies that are the German Marshall Fund, the Atlantic Council, the French American Foundation, and at the deep on the MAF and Hand-to-Pen Foundation and others, and so on and so on. So yes, the NSPA was a little bit screwed up before this NATO summit, but you will agree that you did not hear much about it. And then anyway, no one explains to you what the NSPA is. Nobody explains to you how weapons are purchased and where and who takes care of them. No one explains to you how weapons are purchased and from where and who takes care of them. Obviously, it would stick out, and therefore they are not doing it. Welcome to Operation Transparency. If you like this video, don't forget to like it and don't forget to comment. We need comments, first of all, for SEO. It's important for us, but also a number of you are making very relevant comments, and that would be interesting for us on these corruption issues to know if you think that we have gone too far or not far enough, if we should dig into this or that aspect. And what topic would you like us to focus on to
reveal corruption or the risks of corruption, or the gray areas behind the appearances of power, behind what is shown on the stage, behind the political theater. Thank you all. I wish you a great day. Don't forget to subscribe. Subscribe on TikTok, subscribe on our Telegram feed. See you very soon for the next transparency operation.